Good morning. I want to begin today by saying something that I believe requires being stated plainly, without political framing, without partisan inference, and without the kind of rhetorical decoration that too often substitutes for serious economic analysis in moments like this one. What has occurred over the past several weeks, culminating in the agreement signed on American soil between the Government of Canada and a coalition of American state level economic authorities, municipal trade councils, and regional agricultural boards, is not a minor procedural development. It is not a footnote in the ongoing story of North American trade relations. It is, by any serious measure of economic consequence, a structural realignment of the kind that trade economists spend careers theorizing about and rarely live to witness in real time. And I think the American public deserves a full, honest, and rigorous accounting of what this agreement means, how we arrived at this moment, and what the policy implications are for the United States economy going forward into 2026 and beyond. Let me begin with context, because context is everything in economics. When the tariff schedule that has been the subject of so much public debate was first introduced, the stated rationale was threefold. First, that it would protect American manufacturing jobs by making foreign produced goods more expensive relative to domestically produced alternatives. Second, that it would generate federal revenue sufficient to offset other fiscal obligations without requiring corresponding tax adjustments elsewhere in the budget. And third, that it would function as a negotiating instrument, a form of economic pressure that would compel trading partners, Canada chief among them, to accept revised terms on a range of bilateral issues, including softwood lumber, dairy access, aluminum, and automotive components. These were the three pillars upon which the tariff architecture was constructed, and I want to address each of them in turn, because the agreement signed this week has, with remarkable efficiency and precision, rendered each of those three rationales either obsolete, counterproductive, or structurally void. Let us begin with the first pillar: job protection. The argument that tariffs protect American manufacturing employment is one with a long and complicated history in economic literature. There are conditions under which targeted, time limited tariffs can provide breathing room for domestic industries facing unfair foreign competition. Conditions involving currency manipulation, illegal subsidization, or deliberate dumping of goods below cost. These are the legitimate applications of trade remedy law, and they have a defensible place in a rules based international economic order. However, what the data has consistently shown, and I am referring here to peer reviewed economic research, Federal Reserve regional studies, and the findings of the Congressional Budget Office, is that broad based tariffs applied across entire commodity categories do not, on net, produce employment gains in the sectors they are intended to protect. What they produce instead is a redistribution of economic pain. Some jobs are preserved in protected sectors. A larger number of jobs are lost in sectors that depend on the tariffed inputs as raw materials. The steel worker may keep his position for another 18 months, but the automobile assembler, the construction contractor, the appliance manufacturer, each of whom requires steel as a productive input, faces higher input costs that compress margins, reduce competitiveness, and ultimately lead to workforce reductions that dwarf the preservation achieved upstream. This is not a political argument, it is arithmetic. And the agreement that Canada has now executed on American soil exploits this arithmetic with a sophistication that I find frankly impressive from a purely technical standpoint. What Canada has done, and I want the American public to understand this clearly, is identify the precise pressure points within the American supply chain where Canadian origin goods are not merely convenient alternatives, but are in fact structurally necessary inputs for which no near-term domestic substitute exists at comparable cost or scale. Potash is perhaps the clearest example. The United States imports approximately 85% of its potash from Canada. Potash is not a luxury commodity. It is not a discretionary import. It is the foundational fertilizer input upon which American agricultural productivity, the productivity that feeds not only this nation but significant portions of the global food supply, directly depends. When a tariff is placed on Canadian potash, the cost does not disappear. It is transferred. It moves from the border crossing point directly into the operating budgets of American farms, which pass it forward into the price of corn, soybeans, wheat, and every downstream food product derived from those crops. The American consumer pays the tariff, not Canada. The American farmer absorbs the margin compression, not Ottawa. And what the new agreement does is formalize an alternative routing structure, one that allows Canadian potash producers to transact through a newly established cross-border commercial framework that is legally domiciled on American soil, but operationally structured to bypass the tariff trigger points in current federal customs law. I will return to the legal architecture of this framework in detail, but I want the significance of this to land before I move on. Canada has, in effect, built a door through the tariff wall and built it inside the wall itself. The second pillar, revenue generation, requires equal scrutiny because this is where I believe the most consequential misunderstanding has taken root in public discourse. Tariff revenue is real. I do not dispute that. The Treasury does collect receipts from import duties, and those receipts have increased in nominal terms since the expanded tariff schedule took effect. But tariff revenue must always be evaluated net of its economic costs. And when you conduct that evaluation honestly, when you account for the retaliatory measures implemented by trading partners, the supply chain disruption costs absorbed by American businesses, the agricultural export losses resulting from counter tariffs on American soybeans, pork, and wheat in key Asian and European markets, and the downstream consumer price inflation that functions as a regressive tax falling most heavily on working and middle class households. The net fiscal picture is considerably less flattering than the gross revenue line suggests. The Peterson Institute for International Economics, the Tax Foundation, and the Federal Reserve Bank of New York have each published analyses reaching broadly consistent conclusions. That the net economic cost of the current tariff regime to the American economy exceeds the gross revenue collected by a factor that ranges, depending on methodology, between 2 and 4 times. That means for every dollar of tariff revenue that enters the Treasury, between $2 and $4 of economic value is being destroyed elsewhere in the system. This is not a sustainable fiscal strategy. It is a consumption of national economic capital dressed in the language of revenue policy. And now, with the Canadian agreement formalized and operational frameworks being established in states including Michigan, Minnesota, North Dakota, and Montana, states that are, it bears noting, among the most economically exposed to both Canadian trade flows and agricultural commodity markets, the revenue projection models that were used to justify the tariff schedule must be revised downward. Because what the agreement effectively does is reduce the taxable import volume flowing through conventional customs channels without reducing the actual volume of Canadian goods entering the American economy. The goods still move. The economic activity still occurs. The jobs supported by that activity, on both sides of the border, are preserved. But the federal revenue that was supposed to justify the policy is diminished because the transactional architecture has been legitimately restructured to operate within a different legal framework. I want to be precise here. I am not suggesting that this agreement involves any circumvention of law. The legal teams on both sides have been meticulous, and I have reviewed the framework documentation with considerable care. What I am saying is that the tariff policy, as designed, contained structural vulnerabilities that a sophisticated trading partner with deep institutional knowledge of American commercial law was always going to find and exploit. And Canada has done precisely that, not illegally, not aggressively, but with a calm, methodical economic competence that should prompt serious reflection among those responsible for trade policy design in this administration. I want to turn now to the third pillar upon which this tariff architecture was constructed, the argument that tariffs function as a negotiating instrument, a form of structured economic pressure capable of compelling a trading partner to accept revised terms on bilateral issues of American priority. This is, of the 3 rationales, the one I find most intellectually interesting because it is not without historical precedent. There have been moments in modern trade history where the credible threat of sustained tariff pressure has produced genuine negotiating movement from counterpart governments. The Section 301 actions of the 1980s against Japan produced measurable concessions in certain semiconductor and automotive subcategories. The steel safeguard measures of the early 2000s, though ultimately ruled inconsistent with World Trade Organization obligations, created negotiating leverage that was used with some effectiveness in bilateral discussions. So I do not dismiss the instrument categorically. What I would argue, with considerable conviction grounded in both historical analysis and current observation, is that the instrument's effectiveness is entirely conditional on the target economy being structurally dependent on American market access to a degree that makes sustained resistance economically untenable, conditional on the absence of viable alternative markets for the goods being pressured, and conditional on the domestic political economy of the target nation being sufficiently fragile that economic pain translates into political capitulation rather than political consolidation. And I would submit to you, with the evidence now plainly before us, that Canada satisfies none of these three conditions, not one. Let us examine each condition with the seriousness it deserves. The first condition, structural dependence on American market access, was, I will concede, a reasonable assumption as of perhaps 15 years ago. Canada did, historically, direct the overwhelming preponderance of its export volume toward the United States market, and that concentration created genuine leverage for American negotiators. But what has occurred over the intervening decade and a half is a systematic and deliberate diversification of Canadian trade relationships that has materially reduced that dependence without eliminating it entirely. The Comprehensive Economic and Trade Agreement with the European Union, which came into provisional application in 2017 and has been progressively deepening since, has opened European markets to Canadian agricultural, energy, and manufactured goods on terms that are, in several categories, more favorable than what Canada enjoys under the current North American framework. The Comprehensive and Progressive Agreement for Trans-Pacific Partnership, from which the United States withdrew in 2017, a decision whose long-term strategic costs I have written about at some length, has given Canada preferential access to 11 Asia-Pacific economies, including Japan, Australia, Vietnam, Malaysia, and Chile. Canadian liquefied natural gas export capacity, while still developing, is advancing along a trajectory that will, within the medium-term planning horizon, provide meaningful alternative channels for energy exports currently directed toward the American market. None of this means that the American market is unimportant to Canada. It remains by volume Canada's largest single trading relationship, but the margin of dependency has narrowed considerably, and with it, the margin of leverage available to American negotiators. The agreement signed this week reflects, in part, the confidence of a government that knows it has options. The second condition, the absence of viable alternative markets, is related to the first but distinct in an important way. Even a trading partner with diverse market relationships may lack the logistical infrastructure, the established commercial relationships, and the regulatory approvals necessary to redirect significant export volumes on a timescale relevant to a trade dispute. Rerouting commodity flows is not a simple matter of redirecting a shipping container. It requires renegotiated contracts, adjusted quality certifications, modified packaging and labeling standards, recalibrated insurance and financing arrangements, and the patient cultivation of trust with new commercial counterparts. These are real frictions, and they take time to overcome. The conventional wisdom in trade policy circles has long been that these logistical frictions buy time for tariff pressure to work, that even if a trading partner has theoretical alternative markets, the practical difficulty of accessing them quickly enough provides a window of negotiating leverage. What I am observing in the Canadian case and what the agreement signed this week makes concrete is that this window has closed. Canada has not merely identified alternative markets in the abstract. It has, over the past 18 months of escalating trade tension, actively built the commercial infrastructure necessary to access those markets at scale and with speed. The canola redirections to Southeast Asian crushers, the aluminum offtake agreements with European automotive manufacturers, the potash supply arrangements with Brazilian agricultural conglomerates that are now in their second contract renewal cycle. These are not contingency plans. They are operational realities. And the agreement on American soil is the capstone on a diversification architecture that Canada has been quietly constructing while the public debate focused on rhetoric and counter rhetoric. The third condition, domestic political fragility in the target nation, is perhaps the most significant failure of the tariff strategy's underlying assumptions. And it is the one I feel most compelled to address with care because it touches on matters that go beyond economics into the realm of political sociology and national identity. The assumption embedded in the tariff pressure strategy was that Canadian voters and Canadian businesses facing sustained economic pain from American trade actions would ultimately pressure their government to accept revised terms rather than endure continued disruption. This assumption reflects a misreading of Canadian political culture that is, I think, rooted in a tendency to view Canada through an exclusively economic lens, while underweighting the cultural and historical dimensions of the bilateral relationship. Canada is not simply an economic satellite of the United States. It is a nation with a distinct identity, a strong tradition of institutional independence, and a political culture that, when confronted with what it perceives as external coercion from a more powerful neighbor, tends toward consolidation rather than capitulation. The historical record on this point is unambiguous. Every episode in modern Canadian political history in which American pressure, economic, diplomatic, or otherwise, has been perceived by the Canadian public as overreach has produced not accommodation, but entrenchment. And the current episode has been no different. The Canadian government's approval ratings have risen, not fallen, in direct correlation with the escalation of American tariff pressure. Canadian consumer campaigns redirecting household spending away from American goods have gained traction in ways that market researchers describe as unprecedented in both scale and durability. The political incentive structure for the Canadian government is, at this moment, precisely the opposite of what the tariff strategy required. Concession would be politically costly, resistance is politically rewarding. This is not a coincidence. It is the predictable consequence of misreading the target. I want to pause here and address something that I anticipate some observers will raise, which is the question of whether my analysis amounts to advocacy for a particular policy position or political outcome. I want to be direct about this. My role, as I have understood it throughout my career, at the Federal Reserve, at the Council of Economic Advisors, at the Treasury Department, has been to provide honest, rigorous, data-grounded analysis of economic conditions and policy consequences, regardless of whether that analysis is comfortable for those in positions of authority. I have done this under administrations of both parties. I have delivered assessments that Democratic administrations found inconvenient. I have delivered assessments that Republican administrations found unwelcome. The value of economic analysis, its entire claim to public trust, rests on its independence from political preference. So when I tell you that the tariff architecture applied to Canada has failed on all three of its stated rationales, I am not making a political argument. I am making an empirical one, grounded in the evidence that is now available to us. The agreement signed this week is not a political document. It is an economic document. And its economic implications are serious, far-reaching, and demand honest engagement from policymakers regardless of their partisan affiliation. Let me turn, in the remaining portion of this section, to the specific economic mechanics of what the agreement establishes and why those mechanics matter so profoundly for the American economy's near-term trajectory. The agreement creates what its architects have termed a Continental Commercial Continuity Framework, a somewhat bureaucratic name for what is, in practical terms, a set of interlocking commercial arrangements that allow Canadian goods to enter American commerce through a series of legally distinct channels that fall outside the jurisdictional scope of the current federal tariff schedule. These channels operate through a combination of state-level trade authority, which, under the constitutional structure of American federalism, retains significant independent scope in certain commercial domains, and a series of bilateral commercial agreements between Canadian provincial export bodies and American municipal and county level economic development authorities. The legal architecture is intricate, and I do not propose to render a definitive legal opinion on every element of it. What I can say, having reviewed the framework documentation and consulted with trade law specialists whose judgment I respect, is that the architects of this agreement have identified genuine seams in the jurisdictional fabric of American trade law and have exploited them with precision. The federal tariff authority is broad, but it is not unlimited. It applies to goods crossing the international border through designated customs entry points under standard commercial import procedures. It does not apply or applies only in attenuated form to certain categories of commercial arrangement that are structured differently. And the Canadian agreement is structured differently, deliberately and carefully, in ways that the current tariff schedule did not anticipate and does not clearly reach. I want to spend considerable time in this section examining the macroeconomic implications of the Continental Commercial Continuity Framework, because I believe that the immediate political conversation surrounding this agreement has focused almost exclusively on the bilateral diplomatic dimensions, on questions of national pride, negotiating posture, and the symbolic significance of a Canadian agreement being signed on American territory, while giving insufficient attention to the structural economic consequences that will unfold over the medium and long term. These consequences are, in my assessment, among the most significant that the American economy will face in the coming 24 to 36 months, and they operate across several distinct channels that interact with one another in ways that compound their individual effects. I want to trace each of these channels carefully because understanding them individually is necessary but not sufficient. It is the interaction effects that produce the truly consequential outcomes, and those interaction effects are where conventional trade analysis most frequently falls short. The first channel is the inflation transmission channel, and it is the one most immediately relevant to the daily economic experience of American households. I have spent much of my professional career studying inflation, its causes, its dynamics, its distributional consequences, and the policy tools available to address it. And I want to say something about inflation that I think gets lost in the current public conversation, which tends to treat it as a single phenomenon with a single cause and a single remedy. Inflation is not a single phenomenon. It is a family of related but distinct processes, and the policy interventions appropriate for one type of inflation can be actively harmful when applied to another. The inflation that the United States experienced in the post-pandemic period was, in its origins, primarily a supply-side phenomenon, a consequence of disrupted global supply chains, energy price shocks, and a mismatch between the composition of consumer demand, which had shifted dramatically toward goods during the pandemic period, and the productive capacity of an economy configured to supply a different demand mix. The Federal Reserve's response, the most aggressive interest rate tightening cycle in 4 decades, was appropriate for addressing the demand-side components of that inflation, and the evidence suggests it was effective in doing so. But it could not and did not address the supply-side components, which resolved primarily through the gradual normalization of supply chains rather than through monetary policy action. What I am concerned about now in the context of the tariff regime and the Canadian agreement is a different type of inflation risk, one that I would characterize as a structural input cost inflation, driven not by excess demand or monetary accommodation, but by the artificial elevation of production costs throughout the American supply chain through trade policy intervention.